I think we've started. We are live. How is everyone today? I'm really excited about the Q&A today. It's your chance to ask me any questions you might have about homeschooling. I know when you first start out homeschooling, it can seem like a really overwhelming and daunting task. And it is somewhat complex, and it definitely is something you want to give the proper amount of consideration to because this is your children's education, but it is absolutely doable. And I believe firmly that parents are their children's first and best teachers. You know your children better than any teacher ever could. You love your children more than any teacher ever could. So you are able to figure out the best ways to teach your child. And a lot of it starts with just looking very closely at your child and figuring out what is a good fit for them and how you can best teach them. So I'm excited to get started today, and I hope to see some questions rolling in. So please post your questions. You can post them in the chat, or I think I can also get private messages. If you'd rather do it anonymously, you can just send those to me, and that would just be Jennifer Yurt Pearson that you can send those to. And I will answer them live. And I will also be recording this. I'm pretty sure it's recording, so I can repost it later if you'd like to go back and review any of the answers. So since I haven't gotten any questions yet, I have a few questions that people have sent me already that they sent in ahead of time. And one of those questions is about how to use games in the homeschool. Someone said that they have a child that really likes games, and they wanted to know if it's possible to incorporate games into their homeschool. Well, I have a son and a daughter who both really, really like games as well. And we use a lot of educational games in our homeschool. And I've found there are actually several Facebook groups for games. I actually posted a blog post on my website at confidentlyhomeschool.com about various games that we've used. And there's lots of different ways to find ideas for games. Some of our favorites are the ones that don't even seem to be necessarily educational. I found games that are too educational. My kids kind of see right through those, and they decide that they're not going to have fun with them because they're educational. So sometimes the ones that aren't strictly educational are the best. Things like Yahtzee or Tenzi, things like that that use math, but not as maybe the core part of the game. Other things, I'm looking over at my bookshelf that has our games on it. Some other ones that we like are Flux. That's a game that is not at all meant to be educational, but it has a lot of educational aspects to it because you're reading, you're strategizing, you're learning to be a good winner and a good loser. And the thing about Flux is it's called Flux because the rules can change at any point in the game. And suddenly you may have thought you were going to win, and then they change and you don't win, somebody else wins. So you learn a lot about dealing with disappointment, and that can be a really important skill for kids too. Hey, Stephanie, I'm glad you joined us. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to post them in the comments. And I'm going to take a quick sip of water. I'm trying to think of other games that we really like. We use electronic games as well. Some of the great, there are tons of great iPad games that are educational. One that we really have enjoyed, or my kids have enjoyed, I played it some too, I'll admit, is one called Slice Fractions. And I think it now has 2 different levels. And they learned so much about fractions through that game. They actually played it before we introduced fractions in our homeschool. But by the time we introduced them in our math curriculum, they caught on very, very quickly and understood fractions because of that game. So Slice Fractions, great game. And Osmo also has a lot of neat games for kids that work with the iPad. You do have to buy the extra Osmo kits, which is not the greatest. You've already bought an iPad, now you got to buy the Osmo kits, but they are very hands-on and interactive. They have one called Pizza Company, where a little monster character comes in and orders a pizza, and your child has a little cardboard pizza crust, and they put toppings on it, and then they move it on to the oven, and it gets baked. And then at the end, the person has to pay, and it tells them how much the check is, and then they have to make change. So it's a great way for kids to play and interact with an electronic device, but still be doing something physical in the real world and practicing math. So we've enjoyed that as well. And there's several other Osmo games that are great. There's a coding one that teaches kind of that thinking where you have to think step by step like you do when you code computers. And that's a great game for teaching that skill. Hey, Jessica, glad you joined us. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm kind of just answering some questions that I've already received, but if you have some questions to add, I would be more than happy to answer them. I'm sitting here looking at your name on my screen while I talk to you. The camera is up above my monitor, so it feels a little weird to have to keep looking up at it, but I'm trying to make eye contact with everyone. Anyway, so I could go on and on pretty much all afternoon about games. Hit me up if you want more suggestions. But even things like the classic Monopoly, although that's not my favorite game by any means, it gets a little bit long and boring for me. But things like that, or Clue is a great one for teaching logic skills and just that idea of kind of deductive reasoning. And gosh, there's so many logic games that are just so much fun. My son likes the solitaire logic games. And Think Fun makes quite a few of those. And they usually have a board of some sort, and they give you constraints. And then you have to figure out how you're going to fit in all of the other pieces so that they meet the constraints or work within the constraints. So those are always good too. And they're a great way to occupy kids for a little bit. If you are in a waiting room or if you need to work with one child while the other's occupied, it's a great way to do that. And they're learning and don't even realize it. So let's see. I had a few other questions that came in ahead of time, and I'll just go ahead and grab one of those if we don't have any from our audience so far. So I did want to talk about a question I received about how do you get started with homeschooling as far as the legal aspects of it. So I live in Kentucky, and so far I think everyone who's joined lives in Kentucky. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in Kentucky, you just have to write a letter of intent at the beginning of the school year, and you have to send that in to the director of pupil personnel for your local school district. And for us, there's a template that we use that we have. And so I just send that letter in every year. It has to be sent in within 10 days of the first day of school. So I usually just put it on my calendar around August 1st sometime or August 5th and send it in. And then we are required to complete 170 days with exactly 6.25 hours per day. Although it doesn't mean you have to sit down with a workbook for 6.25 hours per day, because honestly, there's so much learning that goes on in the homeschool that is not just the time you're sitting doing worksheets and things like that. So certainly count everything, count educational field trips, conversations you have, helping with cooking where you're working with fractions and things like that in the course of cooking. There's so many things you do at home that are educational, so it should be very easy to get that 6.25 hours a day. And I do have one question now. Stephanie says, I find after we take a little break from school, sometimes I get a lot of pushback from my kids when it goes to start back with the schoolwork. Any suggestions? I have definitely experienced that too. I find Mondays are always the hardest if we've had a weekend where the kids just kind of were free to do whatever they wanted, which often means they gravitate a little too much toward electronic devices. And that does seem to be the hardest to get them back in that routine. So I guess my suggestion is, first of all, try to ease in kind of slowly. I learned my tendency is to try to jam pack Monday with all sorts of things because I want to kind of get a jump start on the week, but that does not work well for my kids. They do much better with a slightly less structured or less packed day on Mondays, and then kind of ramp up as the week goes on. And the other thing that works well is simply to try to do things that they like and that are geared toward their interests on Mondays. And then you can make it more appealing because it's something they enjoy and that is related to something they like to do. So for example, I keep going back to fractions. We were recently covering fractions, but let's say you're covering fractions with your kids and you know that your child does not like sitting down and doing worksheets. I mean, most kids really don't love doing that for very long, at least. So maybe you can make it a game. Maybe you can get some containers out and some play sand or a colored liquid or something. Maybe even go outside if it's nice weather and get them to pour different amounts using different measuring cup sizes and and give them a quarter cup measure and say, okay, you have to make a cup. How are you going to do it? And they'll figure out pretty quickly 4 of those will make a cup. Different things like that can make it a lot more fun. So sometimes just mix it up a little bit. I think that helps, and try to ease back in to the structure, because it is really hard to go from completely unstructured to totally structured the next day. And most kids seem to rebel with that. Also, for us, do a lot of reading. If you can find some fun, interesting books, usually my kids are pretty willing to sit and listen to a fun book, or even get an Audible book and listen to it, or some kind of an audio book. And you can listen to it even in the car while you're driving places or something like that. And they're a captive audience. They can't get away. So there are lots of different ways to make it a little bit different and to kind of mix things up. And that seems to help. So any other questions? And Stephanie, did that answer your question? Let me know if you want some more suggestions or if you think that might help. I did get a question. A question I see quite often actually is on routines and schedules. And it's kind of related to what Stephanie asked. A lot of people ask, what is your day like? What is your routine? And so I always say, first of all, with everything in homeschool, it is entirely up to you. And every family is different. And you really, really have to look at your kids and yourself and your family and figure out what will work for you. So in my household, we're not morning people. My son is kind of a morning person, but his idea of early morning is like 7:30. But for the most part, we're not real early morning people. So I've learned that trying to stick to a school type schedule where they have to be up early and starting school by 8 a.m. just doesn't make anybody in our household happy. So we have a schedule where we all kind of get up when we wake up, but I try to make sure people are up by about 8:30. My kids don't sleep really, really late usually, although my daughter is nearing the teenage years, so she's starting to sleep later, and that's becoming a bit of an issue sometimes. But we try to get up by about 8:30 or so, and then we have a very relaxed breakfast where we just kind of all get breakfast. Kids watch a little bit of cartoons. We all just ease into the day. I like it because they're occupied watching TV, and I have my coffee, and I know, bad mom, but every now and then them watching TV is not going to kill them. So then after that, we head up to the schoolroom. We're lucky enough to have a schoolroom, but you absolutely don't have to have a schoolroom. But I think it does help to just have some sort of a structure around it, like some way of announcing we're doing school now. So we go up to the schoolroom and they know that that's the routine. After breakfast, we do school. And I've started over the past couple of years giving my kids a checklist of things to do every day. So they really like the idea of checking things off. They like that sense of accomplishment. They like just the visual of seeing, okay, I'm making progress through my day. So they check their things off their list. And then when they're finished with that, they are free to kind of do what they want to do. And I really think it's important to build in time for their personal interests and for them to do things that they are passionate about. And so my daughter has started making and editing videos. She's taught herself how to use some video editing software, so she enjoys doing that. May have her edit this video when we're all done. And then she also she's been playing a video game with some friends, and then they decided to form an idea committee where they are coming up with new ideas for how to make the game even better. And then they are mocking up what the functionality would look like, and they're talking about whether or not this would work in the game, like whether it could be coded without too much effort or if it's kind of a crazy idea. And I didn't ask her to do any of this. She's just incredibly creative, and she's the type, if she wants to do something, she figures out a way to do it. So it's been really kind of fun watching her do those things. She's also my best source of ideas for our homeschool. The other day she came and said, hey mom, could we do a create your own country thing for homeschool? I'm like, sure, I don't see why not. So I sat down and came up with a whole unit study related to creating your own country. So I incorporated some American history into it. So they had to read a little bit of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And we talked about why our country was formed. And we talked about why people form countries and what makes a country cohesive, what sort of qualities, different things like that. And then they made a flag for their countries. They came up with a name. They came up with a country animal. And we're still actually working on it. We took a break this week, but they were really enjoying that. And it was a great way to take what she requested to do and make it happen and to make it educational. And she's much more invested in doing it because it was her idea. And therefore, she's encouraging her brother to go along with it too. And then it also has been a lot of fun because I always found history to be really dry and boring when I was in school. But this way, I can incorporate US history in a way that makes it relevant because they're using the US history to learn how to create their own country or what they might like to do for their country. And eventually, we're going to incorporate in actually voting for candidates. I'm going to make some mock candidates with mock like values and things like that and let them vote for them. And then I might have them run for office too and see what their platforms would be and what they would stand for if they were running for office. So there's lots of different creative ways that you can take your kids' suggestions and turn them into something that you can do in your homeschool. In my opinion, the freedom and the creativity are the two biggest benefits, I guess you'd say, of homeschooling. I love being able to follow my children's interests and to structure things in a way that work best for them and for our family. I love the freedom to travel occasionally when we get a chance and when it's not coronavirus time. I love just being able to say, hey, it's a beautiful day. Let's do school outside today. Or, wow, we had a rough night last night. Somebody was sick or something. Let's all sleep in today and not do school till later. It's just so nice to have that freedom. So to me, that's one of the greatest things about homeschooling. And I do feel like homeschooling is I won't say it always, but I think very often, if done right, it can give your child an education that is just as good, if not better, than the best private school, because you can tailor it to your child. And I could get on my soapbox here for a minute, so I'm just checking to make sure there's no other questions. Hey, Thomas. Haven't talked to you in ages. Thanks for joining. But okay, I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a second here. And I'm going to say that I think that there's a big difference between teaching and a child learning. So a child can be taught something, as they often are in school, but they don't always learn it. So teaching is the act of just spewing out information and trying to give it to someone else. And I taught in a college for 5 years, and actually 6 years. and I got up there, every few days, and I was talking with the college students and I was presenting information to them. But very often I would look out and I could tell they weren't exactly picking up what I was putting down, so to speak. Like they were just kind of, like, unless I said this is going to be on the test, they weren't really paying much attention sometimes. And the same is true when you teach your children. You can teach them, but if they're not interested, they probably won't learn it, at least not for very long. So learning occurs when we're interested in something, when we're invested in it, like when we see that it has a benefit for us or that we see that we need it for the future, then we're much more likely to actually make an effort to absorb that information. Now, kids can learn things for a test, and tests can be motivating, but I'm sure you all can relate to the fact that sometimes you learn something for a test and then quickly forget it. So if you really want your child to remember something long term, you have to find a way to make it interesting and engaging, or to relate it to something that they care about. And it also helps, just from the psychology of learning, to hook that new knowledge onto something they already know. So if your child is already interested in, let's say, Pokemon, for example, I know lots of kids can tell you every possible Pokemon, and they can tell you which class they belong in. I think that's what they call it. But I know there's like water Pokemon and land Pokemon and fire and all this sort of thing. So there's all these different classes. Well, you can relate that to how animals are classified in the real world. So there are ways to take something they already know and then hook the new knowledge that you want them to know onto that. Or I've even taught a little bit of like Latin and Greek root words based on Pokemon names, because a lot of them actually use root words in their names. So you can take whatever your children are interested in and use that as a vehicle to teach anything else. All right, another question from Stephanie. Thanks for getting me off my soapbox there for a minute. She said, sometimes I worry that the schoolwork we're doing is not enough, or my kids are falling behind. How can I stay on track? That is actually a really common concern and a common question. And there are a couple different answers to that. First of all, a lot of homeschoolers will tell you grade level doesn't matter. And as long as they're moving forward, as long as they're learning, there's no falling behind. I have never in my heart been able to get like really behind that. It's just, I think, I don't know. I come from a school background. I was like a career student for a good portion of my life. So I have a hard time just accepting that there's no like level where your kids should be. I think you need to have some kind of milestones. So what I would suggest is at the beginning of each year, really think about each of your children and make a plan for them. So tell them, or not tell them, but sit down with some notes, like actually write some things down and say, okay, this is, my first child I'm going to think about. How are they doing? What are their strengths? What areas do we need to work on? There are lots of different websites you can look at to find out what children should know at various grade levels if you are interested in finding that information. There are standards for your state, or Common Core has standards. I know everybody hates Common Core, but it does provide a sort of a universal standard for what children should learn in different grades. For homeschoolers, there's also Hewitt Homeschooling. They have a list of what children should know in different grades, and I think World Book Encyclopedia does as well. I know that sounds weird, but they have a list of the skills and knowledge, pieces of knowledge that children should have according to them at different ages. But a lot of this comes down to you. What do you think they should know at this age? Is there an ultimate plan? Like if your plan is for them to be prepared for college by a certain time, then maybe you need to figure out what do they need to know by then? Like especially with math, this is important because you have to kind of work backwards from there. So figure out what they would need to take in high school to get into college, and then figure out what they need in middle school to get the high school class, to get ready for those high school classes. Kind of work backward from your end goal. And then figure out what they need to learn this year. And then once you figure it out, I really don't recommend coming up with a really strict, rigid schedule because life happens. But I do recommend coming up with at least some monthly milestones and targets that you're going to try to hit. And check in with yourself and your children, kind of check on things at the end of every month. Have some built-in checkpoints. Because that way, if you find out, oh gosh, they were supposed to learn this skill this month and we didn't do it, then you have some time to catch up. Because otherwise, if you wait till the end of the year and you're like, oh my gosh, there's 10 things they were supposed to learn this year that we didn't do, it's not too late, but it's going to be a lot harder to catch up after that. So try to set some milestones and some checkpoints in your year when you plan at the beginning. And be flexible. I mean, like I said, life happens, but it's really important to know if you're on track, because if you don't have a plan, then you'll never know. So I think it's important to really lay out a plan, set some milestones and some checkpoints in your year, and try to keep on track. I also highly recommend at the beginning of the year, sitting down with each of your children to plan out the year with them. Now, if they're really, really little, you're going to do most of the planning, but it's still good as much as possible to try to involve them in the planning process. Because again, going back to my learning versus teaching discussion, if your child is involved in the process, they will be more invested in it. They'll understand why it's important, and they'll feel like they had a say in it, and it won't just be something that's being done to them. I think that's very often where school is a negative for kids, or where they don't see the value in it because it feels like something that they're being forced to do or something that's just being done to them. Whereas education should be something that we co-create with our children. It should be a plan that we help them to create with us. And I think that's really important when you pick resources. So whether you're picking a math curriculum or what you're going to study this year in history or science, if you can bring your children into that process and really get their input, you will have a much easier year. It will be much more beneficial for them. There will be less fighting, and generally it will just go a whole lot better. And plus, it's just a great skill to teach your children, to be able to set a goal and plan for it and figure out the steps you need to reach that goal and that kind of thing. Let's see, I've got a few other things that popped up. Hang on, I'm going to get a sip of water. Hey, Caradwin. Hey, Cricket. Hey, Janelle. Thanks for joining. And Leah. Everybody, thank you. Let's see. So Cricket says, how do you incorporate the arts into an at-home curriculum? That's a great question. And I know the arts are, to me, I think they're a very important area. I think the arts are what make us human. They're what enable us to express our feelings and just to connect with other people in a deeper way than you can in a lot of other ways. But I also know that a lot of parents don't feel comfortable with art. They maybe aren't so artistic themselves, or they don't like the mess of it in their home, or they don't have any musical skills. You know, there's lots of reasons why people find the arts to be a little bit, I guess, uncomfortable when it comes to homeschooling. So there are many, many different options. There are, first of all, private lessons that you could sign your child up for music. And then also, at least here where I live in Louisville, we have a paint your own pottery place that does homeschool classes once a month. We have it's one of the canvas, like the painting on canvas places, Wet Your Palette out in Anchorage. They do a homeschool class. Last I checked, it was kind of on request, but they do a homeschool painting class. And then for middle and high school students, there's the Louisville Creative Arts Academy. And my daughter participated in that last year, and it's fabulous. They have all sorts of different classes in the arts. They have drawing classes, musical theater. They had a costuming class. They had, let's see, there was one, my daughter didn't take all of them, so I'm trying to think of the rest of them, but they had a impromptu acting class and a lot of different things. I think playwriting, all sorts of things, but that's for middle and high school homeschoolers. So for the younger crowd, there's a lot of other things you can do. Like I said, with the pottery painting or canvas painting, or some of the co-ops offer art classes as well. And the other thing I've started doing is my daughter just loves to draw. So I am a little bit artistic. I haven't done a lot of it in years, like since college, but I do like art. But I bought the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, and I've started going through the lessons with her, and they're very just open and go kind of lessons. You don't have to have an artistic background. It's actually written for people who aren't that artistic or aren't that comfortable with art. And it's a lot of fun. And it starts just like kind of where you are. Just the first few assignments are just draw something. And then you eventually get to the point where you can compare near the end of the book your artwork that you're creating then to what you created at the beginning. So we've been having a lot of fun with that. And she was so excited that I was incorporating an art class into homeschool. So it's good, again, to follow your kids' interests. And if they are interested in drawing, even if you aren't, make sure you try to incorporate that in some way. Let's see, anybody else have any questions? Sorry, drinking water like crazy. When I talk a lot, my mouth gets dried out. So let's see. So I hope that answered the question about the arts. There are really a lot of opportunities for that, and really a lot of opportunities for homeschoolers that I think new homeschoolers might not realize, just social opportunities. I was talking to someone the other day and I said, you know, when we first started homeschooling, socialization was a real problem, and not in the way you would think. Really, it was that we had so many opportunities to socialize that I found it hard to figure out which ones to do and how to do them and still get our structured academic type work done. Because I do think socialization is very, very important. It's important to get out and be with other kids and be with other families. And I mean, I'm kind of an extrovert, so I don't want to just sit at home by myself all the time. And I don't think it's healthy for the kids to do that either. But at least before coronavirus, there were all sorts of play dates. We had one group that met 3 times a week that we often went to. And then there were always just the pop-up kind of, hey, it's a beautiful day, we're all going to the zoo or going to the park, who wants to join us kind of things. And then there's co-ops, there's cottage schools, there's enrichment programs. There are just so many different things that you can sign your kids up for, or even do more spur of the moment if you want to get out and be around other kids and other families more. Let me check and see if I missed any questions. Doesn't look like it. Well, if anybody else has any, please type them in. Or like I said earlier, if you want your question to remain anonymous, you can private message that to me. And let's see if I've gotten any. Let's see. All right. Somebody sent me a message about tests. And so, just so you know, in Kentucky, oh, and I meant to say this earlier when I was talking about the legal requirements for homeschooling, it is different for every state. So, I mentioned Kentucky's because that's where I live, but there are lots of other states that have similar or different regulations. So, the best way to find those is to go to hslda.org, and then you can click on, I think it's find the regulations for your state. It's pretty obvious once you go to the page. It has a big map of the US and it shows, they kind of break the states down into tiers of which are the least and most restrictive for homeschooling. But then you can click on your state and actually see the regulations for your state and what's required. But related to that, some states do require homeschool children to take some sort of a standardized test every year, but a lot of states don't, and Kentucky doesn't. But I have always wanted the reassurance of having some kind of a test every year just to make sure we're on track. So I was lucky enough when we first started homeschooling, I had been in a PhD program in the education department at Bellarmine University, and one of my professors there was incredibly supportive about me quitting to homeschool. She said that she completely understood and that if she had it to do over, she would have homeschooled her children. And she said, I'd be glad to test your kids. I'll do a baseline now and then I'll test them every year that you homeschool. So she did that for us for the first couple years. And then she retired and moved away. So we haven't had that for the past few years. But it was really helpful just to have that baseline and then also to kind of see their progress every year. And it helped me to identify any potential problems that were developing or any potential gaps in their education. So it didn't cover everything, of course, but it covered kind of the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So since we have lost our friend in the education department, I found there is a standardized test, and I'm sure there are others, but the one we have used for the past few years is from Hewitt Homeschool. Yeah, same place I mentioned earlier. And it's called the PASS test, PASS. And you can just go to their website and I think it should be in the drop down box or something, but you can just search for Hewitt, HEWITT, homeschool PASS test. And it's a standardized test that is used by a lot of homeschoolers, and it's not timed. So it's great for kids who have some test anxiety or who just can't sit and pay attention for long periods of time. And it's the fill in the bubble kind of test. So in a way, I think that's kind of good that they have at least some exposure to that type of test, because eventually, if your kids go on to either high school that's not homeschool, or if they go on to college, they're going to have to take standardized tests at some point. So being familiar with that, of course, by the time a lot of kids take those, it'll all be on computer and they won't need to fill in the bubbles, but still it's good experience. So anyway, so you take the test, you have them fill in the bubbles, and then you mail the test to Hewitt Homeschooling and they score it and send you your results back. And I just always keep those in my homeschool record folder and never have had to use them for anything, but in case I ever do, I have them. And it just gives me that reassurance that they are continuing to progress and learn every year. And the other thing about tests, so since we homeschool, I have always kind of thought tests weren't that necessary because I'm sitting right there with my kids most of the time when they're doing their schoolwork, and I can tell if they're missing problems or if they don't understand something. So a test just seemed superfluous. But I've learned my kids actually like tests. I know that's so weird, but they requested tests. They actually told me that they wanted to take tests because it lets them see their own progress. And I don't know, I guess it gives them that, I don't want to say reassurance, because I don't think it's so much reassurance as much as like just kind of a feeling good that they've accomplished something. And so we've started doing tests on Fridays. So every Friday they have a math test and a spelling test. And then if they've been reading something over the week, I usually make up some questions and ask them some questions about that as well. And I have them do it in written form so I can then put that in their homeschool folder for the year and keep track of that. But they really have enjoyed it. I mean, the first time they asked me for tests, I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting and they'll give up on this pretty quickly. But they've actually really enjoyed it. And I found I kind of liked it too, because it gives me, again, that reassurance that they are actually learning things and they are keeping on top of like actually remembering it. So we've continued that now for the rest of the year. We started it earlier. Well, we're still going on this school year, but we started it early in the year and we've continued it for the rest of the year and probably will continue for the foreseeable future with that. All right. Anyone else with any other questions? All right. Well, I'm going to throw in one more question that I received before the live stream started, and that is, how do you homeschool kids of multiple ages? I mean, most of us don't have just one child. Some people do, and you can certainly homeschool with just one child. But most people who homeschool tend to have at least two and maybe more. I know some of you, Caradwin, are you here, have like 6. So it's certainly possible to homeschool multiple ages. I think part of it is you have to pick the right curriculum. And some curricula out there are very specific by grade and age, and you can't use them for multiple ages. And others are actually geared toward multiple ages. So again, I don't want to like throw out recommendations for curriculum because I think it's very individual choice. And I think it requires really looking at yourself and your children and figuring out what fits you and your family the best. And so I always hesitate to be like, oh yeah, we've used this, because then everybody runs out and thinks it's the right thing for them, and it may not be. But one curriculum, just for example, that is good for multiple ages is the Bookshark curriculum. It's a boxed curriculum, so it covers pretty much every subject except, well, it does cover math, but you have to pick your math curriculum as part of it. You get some different choices. But anyway, it's geared toward different ages, so it's a range. So we used that our first year because I was able to get one curriculum and it worked for both of my children. It didn't actually work that well for us. It was one of those that seemed great on paper, and I didn't have a clue. I didn't know anything about my kids or myself as homeschoolers when we first started. And so I spent a lot of money on curriculum that ended up not being a good fit. You might have seen that on my Facebook page for my business. I made a little graphic of how much we wasted. It's kind of embarrassing. It was over $1,000 in curriculum that I bought that just didn't work out. And so we ended up using Bookshark for about 7 weeks. And it is a great curriculum. I'm not saying anything against it. It just felt stifling to me. And I think I also was so, at the time, I was so inexperienced that I didn't know how to modify the curriculum and not feel like I had to just throw it out. So when we had a book we didn't like, I changed it. But then that seemed to mess up other things. And then finally I was like, oh, forget it. I'm just stressing too much over this. And I just threw out the whole curriculum. So I think it's important to really plan out things before you go into your homeschool year so you don't waste a lot of money on curriculum like I did. And that's one reason why I've started working with parents to try to help them to plan that out ahead of time, because I just cringe looking back. And it wasn't even just money that I wasted time, and not my time so much as I really wasted time out of my children's education. And I feel like because I switched curriculum so often in math, my daughter kind of fell behind because that left gaps, and then I had to keep starting back at the beginning with the new curricula. So I would strongly recommend planning up front and choosing carefully. Like really think through what you want your days to look like and how much structure you want and how much rigidity you want in your life and in your school structure before you pick something. So let's see, I've got one question. Holly says, you say you're still going. Do you homeschool year round? Yes and no. The first couple of years we did homeschool year round. And I did that partially because when we first started, my kids were in a Catholic school, and I kind of got, I don't want to say fed up, but I kind of got burnt out on the school by about February or March and started seriously considering homeschooling. Maybe it's even earlier than that I started considering it. But by probably March or April, I knew for a fact that we were going to homeschool. And I just couldn't wait. And I was so excited, and I bought curriculum, and I really, really wanted to get started. So like the day after they got out of school, we started homeschooling. And that's really not recommended. They really recommend, or most people recommend, that you have some period of kind of deschooling where the kids just get to be used to being at home and learning at home and that kind of thing. But I was anxious, and they were too. They were pretty excited about it. So we started like May 29th, and we went that whole summer. But we did a more relaxed curriculum over the summer. We did one that was a unit study. It's one called Five in a Row. And it's where you read a book, and they call it Five in a Row because you're supposed to read it 5 days in a row. We found that got to be a little monotonous, but we still read it at least a few days during the week. And then it has different activities that you can choose from that you do related to the book that you do throughout the week. So we did that over the summer, and it was fun, and we incorporated field trips, and it was learning, but it wasn't really super structured, like let's sit down and do workbooks kind of thing. And then after that, that's when we started Book Shark and did that for 7 weeks, and then tried a whole bunch of other things. But our first year was a lot of experimentation and learning and researching curriculum. But anyway, so now we kind of go year round, but we definitely are more relaxed in the summer. Last summer, my kids convinced me to give them the summer off. They have a lot of friends that still go to traditional school, and they said they just didn't think it was fair that they don't get a break in the summer and their friends do. So we kind of took the summer off, but I finally decided, first of all, when we take the summers off, they were not really doing all the great things I'd hoped they would do. Like I hoped if they had the summer off, they would go play outside and they'd want to go to the pool every day and things like that. But it really seemed like more and more they were just gravitating toward electronic devices and wanting to play video games all day, which did not make me happy and did not make me feel like a good parent. And I didn't like the constant nagging to get them away from those devices. So I decided it's better to have some structure in our lives and just build in other things for them to do rather than the electronic devices, which are kind of the default thing when they have nothing better to do. So, so we started doing homeschool kind of year round. This summer, we're doing kind of an alternating schedule where 1 week we do school and 1 week we don't, or at least they only have to do one thing in the week we don't, one thing a day, because they have a friend that they love to play with, and he's only at his mom's house in this neighborhood every other week. So when he's here, I let them get together with him, and he's not in school, so I didn't want them to have to do a whole day of schoolwork before they could go play with him. So we've been kind of doing that this summer. I'm definitely more flexible in the summers. We've gotten in our number of days for the year, so I'm not worried about it. They're fine. I kind of see my summertime as a time to do some fun educational things with them, and also to catch up on a few things that maybe we missed during the school year, or maybe they could use a little extra work on. But again, you can do whatever works for you. There are a variety of ways to homeschool. Some people go year round, and a lot of people do that because then you can be a little bit more relaxed each day versus feeling like you have to really push hard and get a full school day in every single day. You can be a little bit more relaxed every day because you're getting in way more days than you needed to. The other advantage of taking a summer break is it gives you a time to kind of reset and to assess. I do like to take at least a couple weeks off, maybe even a month. I'll probably take July pretty much off from school because I like that chance to take a step back and just to say, okay, what worked? What didn't work? What do we want to do for next year? And that's a great time to have kind of the parent teacher or student conferences and just sit down with each of my children and say, so what worked for you this year? What didn't work for you this year? And then talk about what their goals are and what they want to do for the coming year. And I think that's really important, just to involve them in that process. I think I said that earlier. Anyway, we have about 15 more minutes. Any other questions? Let me see. Sometimes it doesn't seem to scroll down to all my questions. So looks like that's it for now. So let's see. A couple things I did want to mention. I'm so excited that everybody is here. And I would love if you would attend my webinar on Tuesday, June 23rd. So this coming Tuesday. Look at my notes so I remember to tell you everything. I'm going to do a webinar on the essentials for starting homeschool. And a webinar is just sort of an online class. So it will be, I've got an event that I'm going to create on my business page, and you just need to accept or say you're going, and then you'll get the information on how to attend the webinar. because I'd like for everybody to actually be registered for it so I know who's there and can kind of customize what I'm going to present to the people who are attending. And also make sure I'm not just doing a webinar for nobody, because I'd like to actually know who's going to be there. So I would love it if you guys would attend. I know some of you, I'm looking at the names here, some of you are not brand new homeschoolers, but I'm also just going to talk about my ideas, at least, about a good way to start your school year. So even if you've been doing this for a few years, it might be helpful. I will talk about the legal requirements for homeschooling and how to make sure you've done those things. But I'm also going to talk about planning your school year and how to have those conferences with your kids and plan out the year, that kind of thing. All right, any other questions? All right, one other question that I'm going to throw out then that I got the other day was, how do you make history fun for kids? And this is one that I struggled with for a while because, like I said earlier, history was never my favorite subject. I found it to be dry and boring. I'm not good at just memorizing dates and facts. And I'm the type of person, I have to connect them to something I care about or something that's meaningful to me. So history was not at all my favorite subject. And so I really struggled with, well, how do I not let that dislike of history come across to my children? So I've done a variety of things, and I think I've completely changed my mind about history. So first of all, you can use books that the children find interesting. So for little kids, Magic Treehouse books are an amazing way to teach history. One of the local enrichment programs actually had a class in Magic Treehouse, and my son took the class there. And every week they would read a different Magic Treehouse book, or we had to read it at home. And then he'd go into class and they would do different activities related to the book. And they would discuss the book and maybe draw something or color something related to it. And so he really enjoyed that. He also really liked another class they had, which was also history related. And it was centered around the Who Was books. You know, the ones with the giant face where the people look really strange and they have the tiny little body. So there's all sorts of different Who Was books, and they now have a book from that same Who Was series, and I think it's called, looking because I've got it over on my table. I think it's called the Who Was History of the World, and it can be a great spine for your history program, and because it's basically a timeline of history, and it has all of the different characters in there that are in the individual Who Was books. So I think if you picked out all of the individual ones, you'd be reading 100 books or more, which would be way too much. But pick out a few, go through the history book and pick out, every third or fourth or whichever ones seem exciting to you, and read those Who Was books. And then just kind of use that Who Was history book as the spine to guide your progression through the timeline. So that's another thing. And we did this past year, and my son enjoyed that a lot because he likes the Who Was books. So that's another thing you can do. Another idea is, with history, it's one of those subjects that you don't have to do it in the same order as anyone else. Even if you think your kids are going back to school next year, if they do something different for history this year, that's not going to impact them, because history is not a subject that builds on itself. So feel free to do whatever your kids find interesting. So I think we did ancient history 2 years in a row because my kids just were fascinated by the Egyptians and ancient history. So we did that. And there's a company called History Unboxed, and they sell these fabulous kits for doing things related to history. So we had one where they had to paint a sarcophagus for a mummy, and then they got to mummify an apple using a special type of salt that came in the kit. And I'm trying to think what else. They had all sorts of different things like that, but they're all very hands-on, interactive, and are a great thing to add to the history curriculum to just make it more interesting and engaging for your children. The other thing that I think is fabulous to do, and I think I might do with my kids this year, but have to run it past them to see, since we're co-creating the education, I want to make sure they're okay with this. But I think it's fascinating to look at local history, and you can incorporate so much into local history. And so there are lots of books you can get on local history, and there are some that even have pictures of buildings that still exist, but show them back from the 1800s or sometime when there were they were in the middle of a field, and now they might be sitting next to a shopping mall. or it shows a building with a different kind of sign in front of it, and now it's, something totally different. But it's a lot of fun for kids to see how things have changed over time and to kind of see that progression of history. And then you can also incorporate your own family history into that. So for me, one side of my family grew up, we're from Louisville for a very, several generations. So it's kind of neat to say, well, this is where, your grandparents lived, and this is where your great grandparents lived, and, various relatives, and talk about how they immigrated here and different things like that. So you can incorporate that. And then you can also do a DNA test and then trace your ancestry back to the countries that your ancestors came from and talk about the history there and talk about, maybe why they migrated. Maybe you don't know for sure, but you might have some ideas based on historical context. So you can do all sorts of things like that with history that make it really fun. And especially for kids, but I think for adults too, if it's personally relevant, it's going to be so much more interesting and they're going to remember it. And then you will have created a framework, kind of a scaffolding, so to speak, for history, where they now have kind of this basis of their place in history and their home in history. And then everything else they learn about history after that can kind of relate to their personal history. And it gives them something to hook that knowledge on. So it makes it much easier to remember and much more relevant and interesting, and therefore more likely to be remembered. So even history, which I thought was kind of boring when I was in school, can be made really interesting. Well, we are about out of time. Any other questions? I appreciate everybody attending today. This has been a lot of fun. I actually really like answering questions about homeschooling. And so again, I have my webinar on Tuesday, and the topic will be essentials for starting homeschool or for starting your homeschool year. That just was an awful long title, so I tried to shorten it. But I also work individually with people, or I've got a group coaching program that I'm starting the week of July 6th. If you're interested, just send me a message and I would be glad to tell you more about it. But I work with parents to help them start homeschooling on the right foot. And I take them from being apprehensive to being confident in their ability to homeschool, and help them to create that plan that we talked about with the milestones and some checkpoints along the way to make sure they're on track throughout the year. I think homeschooling is an absolutely wonderful thing. It's been great for our family. I love being able to see that spark of learning and that light when things, when my kids finally realize something, or when they finally learn something. It's just amazing. I know with my son, he wasn't even reading when we started homeschooling. And so seeing him go from that to all of a sudden, like it seemed like all of a sudden, but seeing him learn how to read was just amazing. And that feeling of, wow, I taught him that. Like I did that kind of, although I know he was a large part of it. But I think that is just one of the most gratifying things about homeschooling. And I think homeschooling is a serious commitment, and you can certainly go it alone. I did when I first started, but it's a whole lot easier if you have somebody to support you and walk you through the process and kind of hold your hand to make sure you're getting everything lined up right and getting everything kind of structured in a way that will work for your family. And I also think it's really, really important to make your homeschool fit you. You can't just do what other people have done. Like I tried that my first year. Most of the things that I bought that ended up collecting dust were things other people had recommended. And they were well-meaning and they were super helpful, but just because it worked for them, it didn't mean it was going to work for us. And in a lot of cases it didn't. So it's really, really important to look deeply at your children and their interests and their needs, and also your own. Figure out what you need as a homeschooling parent and then plan based on that. And try to choose resources that fit your needs. It's also really important to pick resources that fit your goals. Don't buy the resources and then make goals related to them. So I've often heard, well, get this curriculum and just figure out the number of pages in it and divide it by the number of days you're going to homeschool, and that's what you have to do every day. And those are your goals. I disagree. I think you have to figure out what your goal is for teaching and then find a curriculum that helps you to meet that goal. And then you can figure out how you're going to structure it and divide it up over the year. But you have to have those goals and milestones first. That's my opinion, but I think personally, I think it's a good way to do things and it works out well for us. So I don't know. I don't like not knowing how my kids are doing. I'd like to have some structure to kind of guide us through the year and check in on things through the year. I mean, that's not to say that I haven't had a few years where I haven't done that, but those were the times when at the end of the year I was kicking myself because there were things I meant to do that we didn't do, or areas where the kids hadn't done as much as I had hoped. So it's better to find that out as you're going along rather than waiting till the end, because at the end it's almost too late and then you have to play catch up the next year. So, but homeschooling is absolutely, it's fun, it's exciting. We love it. It enables you to have more family time than ever before. It gives you more flexibility in your schedule and allows you to really custom tailor your child's education to them, which I think makes it much better for them. So again, my webinar on Tuesday, and I don't know if I told you the time. Did I tell you the time? It's going to be at 4 o'clock on Tuesday. I don't think I did tell you the time. Because I didn't write it down. So 4 o'clock on Tuesday. If you go to my Facebook business page, which is Confidently Homeschool with Jen Pearson, if you go to that, you'll find the event for the webinar. I'm going to create it as soon as I get off of here. And you can sign up for the event and get the information on how to attend. And I hope to see you there. Have a great afternoon.